All right, hello everyone, in person and online. Take a seat. And welcome to Reap What You Sow, Refuting Misinformation about Farming and Farming Practices with Sid Heeg. I'm Dr. Emma Vossen, the Research Communications Officer here at the GI, and I'd like to take a moment to talk about the Institute and give some context to the land that we work on. So for those who are unfamiliar, the Games Institute, or as we refer to it, the GI, is a research institute at the University of Waterloo that's home to interdisciplinary researchers who seek to advance the study, design, and purpose of interactive and immersive technologies and experiences. We endeavor to be a place where researchers from all backgrounds can come and work together and learn from each other beyond the boundaries of their individual disciplines. It's essential to us at the Games Institute to recognize the enduring presence and traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share the land that we live and work on today. We are working to continually make space for Indigenous scholars, designers, commentators, and creators, and to uplift all voices that are marginalized in both the academic and gaming communities. We acknowledge that the land in which we work and live today is the traditional land of the Attawaddaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. The University of Waterloo, where we work, is situated on the Haldimand Tract, which includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. Our ability to be working and living here now in the Waterloo region and in Ontario is a direct benefit of policies of exclusion and assimilation of Indigenous people during the time of settlement, confederation, and since then. We have a responsibility as such beneficiaries to acknowledge and understand both the history and current experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and for this understanding to inform the work that we do, so that we can stop perpetuating the damages of colonization and begin to repair them. Land acknowledgements like this are just one very small step in this work. So if you want to learn more about the GI or our commitment to anti-racism, decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion, you can check out the GI website where we have a lot of information about that. So today we are joined by a PhD student in sustainability management in the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development, who is going to talk to us about farming disinformation on social media, and I will let them tell you a bit more about themselves. Thank you.
Very much.
This. Right. All right. So, thank you for that introduction, Emma. And also to that effect, I also kind of want to provide some context on my own positionality within this country. And here I have some screenshots of some interactive maps on the Ontario government website that provides details of the various land treaties and the Indigenous reservations that have been set up since before Confederation and then also after. Anything that is in the dark maroon on these maps are the reservations, and it's a good visual tool to show how this province has changed over the centuries. And it includes the actual treaties themselves, so you can read over the documents and see how they were set up, who signed them, and the agreement that was laid out. It's especially important to note that on this image on the right-hand side, you can actually see the size difference between the promised land of the Haldimand Treaty in the light green versus the result of how large the Six Nations is today, which is that kind of squarish dark maroon. So again, very large size discrepancy. And to this effect, I want to acknowledge that my family farm and the farm that my father grew up on, which was located right next to mine, is located on the Between the Lakes Purchase, or Treaty Number 3, which was formalized in 1792 and purchased from the Mississauga Nation. I am a descendant of Dutch immigrants who arrived here in the late 1940s and the early 1950s after World War II. And when we arrived, we brought with us our understandings of farming and land management that may not have been compatible with the new environment we found ourselves on, which carries on the notion of how it's not just the people who are colonized, but also the land. And while we may have learned since then on how to discover the best how to best work with the environment, we are now in this process of colonizing the land still continues to this day.
This is, however, an important part of the immigrant experience. We bring with us what we know of and are familiar with in the context of our previous environments. And I would like to say that even today, much of our farms in this region of southwestern Ontario, many of our communities still have strong ties with the Netherlands, to the point where we constantly look towards the developments being made in agricultural practice and technology that's happening in the Netherlands before bringing the equipment over here and instituting them in our own farms and businesses. So as a descendant of Dutch immigrants and as someone who was raised on a farm, who has farmed for many, many years, having a personal relationship with the land is very important to my daily life. And it's important for me and for us all to recognize how this land has been transformed, especially with the displacement of the original peoples, and ask how can we move forward now and repair the relationships that have been damaged and acknowledge the many treaties that have been broken. So before I get into talking about the misinformation that exists, I also want to introduce myself in my own positionality, as well as to introduce this photo of me and my sister when we were taken when we were very, very young. I am the one on the right, and we are sitting on a very dangerous piece of farm equipment, which is known as a three-wheeler, one of the most unstable ATVs out there. Eventually they were illegal because of how unstable they were when you were trying to turn them. They were very likely to tip, so that's why they're no longer around. But in introducing myself and my personal context as a researcher, I find it's very important to understand and state because of how it affects my research and the approach I take. As I have stated previously, I'm a descendant of a long line of Dutch farmers. My father grew up on a dairy farm, which you might be able to just make out in the background of this photo. And my mother also grew up on a chicken farm. I grew up on a pig farm that had about 100 acres of land that was to be farmed before eventually my father bought into a greenhouse operation. And for many years of my life, before I finally left to complete my master's, I worked among tomatoes. So I have a vast amount of knowledge of the many varieties of farming, specifically within southwestern Ontario. I am still very connected to what happens in my home communities, even though the pig farm that I grew up on was sold to my cousin, who transformed it into a dairy farm, and then we sold our greenhouse for it to be turned into a marijuana operation, which is a consistent theme within farming, is this constant change and shifting of properties, and again, revolutionizing and how to transform the spaces. So this is nothing new, but regardless. But even then, I have witnessed the many stresses and frustrations of farmers from many walks of life. Much of my understanding is foregrounded in the conversations I've had with my father, frustrations that stem from consumers' lack of knowledge of what he actually does and how he feels he always needs to justify what he does. To a sense of loss of trust in community. This is most commonly represented in the dwindling pool of labor many farmers face today, and how many farms are heavily reliant on migrant labor simply because people in our own communities no longer wish to work on our farms. So what I will be speaking of today is only a small piece of the issues I hope to explore later on, and it is my hope that you all learn a little bit about the state of farming in the world today and the issues farmers face today. So as a researcher, I encourage you all to really understand who you are and what personal experiences you are bringing into your places of study, of work, because they will affect the ways in which you see and understand something. And it's important to understand what we may be biased towards and what we may be misinformed on. So with that, now we're going to get actually into misinformation. So my research largely focuses on the conceptualizations of misinformation and applying that to farmers specifically. I hope many of you are familiar with this concept because it's become a significant buzzword in the past 2 years, which is misinformation. Misinformation has become a hot topic since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and as you can see with this Google Trends image, it spiked in March of 2020. And has been at a high ever since, often rising and falling with new developments in terms of how we treat COVID. So what is misinformation and how does it work? Well, first we have to differentiate it from disinformation, which is a deliberate form of spreading false information. So it's basically like you are actually telling a lie, and you know it's a lie. But misinformation is regardless misinformed, so you may not know it's actually a lie at first. I liken this to the game of telephone. As further down the chain you go, information is watered down, removed from its context, and changed to suit the situation or the belief at hand until it is so removed from its source point that it's difficult to determine what is and isn't real. And this constantly plays out in the digital landscape, which Banerjee and Rao in their paper Psychology of Misinformation in the Media have coined as a digital infodemic. Not only are we bombarded with massive amounts of information on a daily basis, but also we are not equipped with the tools to parse through this information and assess if it's credible or not. If there is anything we have learned since the start of the pandemic, it is that we are woefully ill-equipped to handle information on this scale. And that those who are susceptible to misinformation or who participate in the active spreading of misinformation are just as much victims or as they are perpetrators of a system that rewards them for their falsehoods. And the reason why I study misinformation about farming is because it's a very personal experience for me. When explaining my own lived experience to people, I've been told that how I lived makes it feel like I was from the 13th century. It's one part funny, but also makes me really sad because apparently how I lived seems backwards. It seems antithetical to the progress and development made in cities. It makes me sad and frustrated that there are people out there thinking that I shouldn't be living in the place that I did. As you can see with this one screenshot on the far left of this person trying to reduce, stating, there's a method to reduce car dependency. Why don't we all just relocate the people in the country to the cities, which will not solve anything. So because of the majority of the people who live in the city, there's no reason why you should need to consider where your food is grown, how it's grown, and who is growing it. The vast majority of people have been removed from the farm, and from recent statistics, only about 1% of the Canadian population is classified as a farmer or farm worker. 1% to feed the rest of the 99%. And that isn't even mentioning the amount of imports of food that come across the border every day. No greenhouse in this region is growing tomatoes in January. You are getting them from Mexico. So, and from this lack of knowledge, that's where the festering of misinformation begins. It can be benign, so most people probably won't question where their food was grown and if it was done ethically or sustainably. And as you can see from this one TikTok screenshot, this user had no idea that cows are only milked 2 to 3 times a day for maybe 10-minute intervals, and maybe sometimes less. But then you get the misinformation that borders on disinformation, and that's where it's more malignant, which can blow something out of proportion. So in the last screenshot I have here on the right, this is a comment thread that I have from the TikTok video here. And this person thinks that they think cows shouldn't be bred to suffer overproduction, and that there's no reason for first world countries to still be eating dairy. And this entire comment thread on this video goes on, but this person is insisting that many health issues are bred into dairy cows specifically. This is one part true and one part false, so we're going to break it down a little bit. The first is that humans have been selectively breeding cows, and not to mention other animals for thousands of years. This is nothing new. But to suggest that they are purposefully bred with genetic issues is false, because you want healthy animals that will be living pain-free for a long time. In terms of farm as a business, that's just a sustainable business strategy. But also for the animals' welfare, you want safe and content animals. And this is how misinformation can work. It's these small moments of mistruths and half-truths that don't give you the full story. And there's so much I could say on the ethics and science behind animal breeding and farming, but we don't have enough time in the day to go over that. And that'll be a running theme when you're approaching misinformation, because it takes so long to produce all the viable information, whereas misinformation is very easy to share and pass around because it doesn't matter about the source. Whereas when you're trying to debunk it, it really, really does. So that's when you have to spend days poring over the research, the science, and speaking to actual experts. And by the time you return with a fully fleshed out answer, the conversation has already moved on. So the digital landscape I focus on is rather a general understanding of how farmers and consumers use sites like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. TikTok is currently the most interesting place in terms of my research because of how well farmers have adapted to the site. Because it is a video platform, farmers are able to share their story, their livelihoods and workplace practices right there just as they are using their phone. This gives them an incredible amount of agency to talk about. themselves and refute misinformation as it comes across them in comments or video responses. And here I have listed some broad categories of misinformation that I've come across online or just in general conversations. But there largely seems to be this concern that either farmers don't know what they're doing or they're doing stuff that will harm the consumers on the other end. And it largely speaks to a lack of trust the consumer has in the people producing their food. The largest example that I have here is the treatment of animals, because you have very public organizations like PETA making very bold claims about the state of dairy farming and farming with animals. So just this example that I have here of some PETA protesters stating that sheep suffer from wool production. Sheep don't. The ones that are bred for wool need to be sheared because their wool keeps growing, and as it keeps growing and you don't shear it on a regular schedule, it starts to mat up and it pulls on their skin. It gets really, really heavy. So sometimes you'll see a video of a sheep that got lost for 2 years, and they'll find the sheep and it's just covered in wool and you can barely see its own face. It can barely stand up, and then eventually you have to shave all that off, and it's like an 80-pound mat of wool that you have to take off. Not only that, but sheep shearing has to be done by hand, and the people who do that are very competent at their job as they bodily handle a sheep that's perfectly content with what it's doing. So if you're watching videos of a sheep shearer bodily handling a sheep, there is also a misunderstanding of actual animal behavior, because people think the sheep is being abused because, oh, look, it's being tossed around, but the sheep is allowing that to happen to itself. It's just lying around, it knows the drill, it's perfectly content with it. So there's a huge misunderstanding of actual animal behavior, and there's not much, they don't really read into the actual animal behavior science as a field to actually understand why is the animal acting the way that it does. So, how can we address the misinformation about farming? Well, the first part is obviously listening to the farmers themselves. One of the dairy farmers I follow on TikTok is Iowa Dairy Farmer, or Dan. He is a 4th-generation dairy farmer that manages a farm of almost 200 cows that are milked by a robotic milker. The majority of his content is educational in that he shows his workplace, his barn, his cows, the equipment he uses, and talks about the many problems he faces in dairy, but also from misinformed consumers who want to slander the work he and many others do. And having this window into his life on the farm, it enables so many other people to have a look at what it's like to live and work on a farm, which is not a common experience anymore. I don't know about you, but I do remember that in high school biology class, my class took a field trip to a dairy farm, which is nothing new for me, but for many of my classmates, that was their first time on a farm. So I want to play this one video to show you the types of misinformation Dan deals with and how he refutes it. So hopefully everyone can hear this. Oh wait. Sorry, it's just my sound is not playing on the TV. Sorry.
We did test this.
It just fell apart. There we go. Let's click on the video.
To your child.
Drugs. No. Too much sugar. Too much screen time. Too many video games. It's gotta be one of those.
And I know you love your kids, and that's not your intention. But unfortunately, the big dairy industry has different intentions. What I want you to understand about all of that milk behind me is that it was produced from cows that were highly stressed.
Here's the real kicker with this guy. He claims to understand biology, how your body works, and all these things milk supposedly does to you. But he also has no idea that for a cow to produce milk, a stress hormone called, one of them is called adrenaline, would actually inhibit her ability to even let her milk out of her udder. She will only release oxytocin from her pituitary gland if she is calm, if she is collected, and if she feels safe. if anything strikes any kind of fear or scaredness into her, it's done. She will not get her milk. So pretty alarming that this guy claims to know how your body works and doesn't even understand the basics of hormones and how it actually affects where the milk goes. Or I should say, how the milk comes out.
Okay, so this video presents a lot of common misunderstandings of dairy farming that you'll see absolutely anywhere. That dairy is bad for children, that milk in grocery stores is heavily processed and filled with chemicals, that the dairy cows themselves are stressed and exploited. But Dan's video here shows an entirely different story. But the problem is that this misinformation never changes, and farmers have to constantly refute the same lies over and over again.
Right.
There we go. So imagine having to justify your job every day, or even your reason for existence. That's what happens in a digital environment. If you're a farmer and you're online and people can find you, this is what will happen. And this is what Dan deals with TikTok. Constant statements of he's an animal abuser, living vegan is better than drinking dairy, and that he's one of the good farmers. One of the few farmers that doesn't abuse their animals, and that animal abuse is actually rampant in the norm on these farms. This isn't normal. Dan shouldn't have to constantly justify why dairy farming is okay and not as destructive or immoral as people claim it to be. This is one of the effects of misinformation on digital media. The constant bombardment of personal attacks is something someone shouldn't have to deal with. But this is the problem with much of social media today. Our algorithms are built to feed us the same information over and over. It reads into so much of our habits without us realizing, to force feed us content and maximize our attention and improve watch time. TikTok is notorious for its algorithm because you don't even have to follow people, and it'll show you content and learn what you like based on how long you are spending looking at a video. But what is shown to you is still carefully curated, which can lead to a heavy amount of bias and misinformation. This has been the subject of countless think pieces and commentary of how responsible are algorithms for radicalizing individuals. Are people entirely innocent before the algorithm shows you content that is harmful? And as it turns out, it's a bit of a mix of both the algorithm acting on your preconceived notions of the world and what you've already been exposed to in your life. In their paper on life extremism, Valentini et al. Examine how radicalization occurs both in the online and offline experience. It's a hybrid experience. But having access to an online community that exposes us to a greater amount of information and ideas that we don't get in the offline experience, it emboldens us to act on the ideas that we're given and seek out like-minded individuals. But those videos you might see of purported animal abuse on farms may not be all that they seem. Once stripped of any meaningful context, it can be used to support any argument against farmers, and farmers are then required to make the same arguments every single time they are faced with these videos and assumptions. This is part I want to be careful on and mindful on discussing, because in 2020, an animal rights protester by the name of Reagan Russell tragically died when she was struck and killed by a truck transport that was driving into a slaughterhouse just inside Burlington, Ontario. It's a bit unclear as to if Russell was standing on the side of the road or if she was simply crossing to the other side, but the driver was charged with reckless driving, and the investigation conducted by the Halton Regional Police did not discover any criminal intent into the incident. This was simply a tragic accident, but this is something that misinformation can lead to. Once someone buys into the misinformation, that starts to affect their behaviors and actions, and it'll put them in harm's way. It's happened with the COVID vaccine. At the very least, misinformation will lead to someone to do or say some questionable things. At its worst, it'll get someone killed. It'll make people put themselves into harm's way. So in this case, what happens? What do we do when people's lives are in danger? Well, what the Ontario government decided to do was pass Bill 156, the Security from Trespass and Protecting Food Safety Act, but even then, the misinformation continues. Because this is essentially the conversation that happens from the animal rights side of things, take a note of the language that they're using, versus what various farming associations actually say about the bill. Bill 156 is what some may call an ag-gag law because it largely prevents animal rights protesters from protesting in certain locations or interacting in certain ways, such as giving water to pigs in transport or trying to touch those pigs in transport. It would also prevent protesters from illegally trespassing on farms and food production facilities. To these groups, they see it as an issue of free speech, as an issue of the government really wanting to hide animal cruelty, whereas the Ontario Federation of Agriculture sees it as something that will protect farms, families, and livestock. Because let me tell you, as a kid who grew up on a farm, those barns were literally in my backyard. I cannot imagine to you how scary it would be for someone to randomly be trespassing on the place that I live to get a video and say, look at what this farm does. So this screenshot is from a website dedicated to Bill 156 that provides the overarching context of why the bill was needed, testimonials from farmers and truckers that have to deal with this type of harassment on a fairly regular basis. That has all around created unsafe and often dangerous working environments, not only for the truckers, but also for the protesters. Russell's death is nothing short of tragic, which is why we need more secure measures to prevent these tragedies from occurring. The bill opens up by stating that it is intended to protect farm animals, the food supply, farmers, and others from risks that are created when trespassers enter places where farm animals are kept or when persons engage in unauthorized interactions with farm animals. The risks include the risk of exposing farm animals to disease and stress, as well as the risk of reducing contaminants into the food supply. The bill also states that if protesters have the willing consent of the driver, they can still come up and interact with the livestock in the trucks. So there's not much of a loss here other than implementing further safety restrictions, preventing further harm and duress to the animals, the workers, and the protesters themselves. Especially since the protesters are going to these farms to record evidence of abuse, they could be carrying diseases on the bottoms of their shoes and possibly infect the entire barn. I cannot state how important it is that people know you cannot just wander onto any farm you like without incurring potential harm. On my pig farm, we were required by law to put up signs that warned individuals to stay away if they weren't authorized to enter. It's an issue of hygiene. This isn't some ploy to make people think we're doing something nefarious behind closed doors. It's merely an issue of food security and safety. So, now that we know all of this about farming, misinformation, and the dangers it can lead to, what do we do? How can we address this? Do I expect everyone to go and work on a farm for a year just so that you can understand how your food is grown? No, that is an impossible standard to hold people towards. Just as I don't expect you to know all the work processes that have led to the phone in your pocket or the clothes that you wear. It's an unrealistic expectation for people to always be aware of everything that happens in the world that makes life possible. It's why everyone at some point in their life becomes specialized in one role, in one area that helps make society possible. Whether that be farming, garbage collection, medical research, or the various stuff that we do here in the Institute in our daily lives. What misinformation stems from is a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding, which is why some of the methods we can address this is by education. There are many farmers out there who take up education as part of their job. My aunt happens to be one of these people, and she's been a dairy educator for 30 years and regularly visits schools and other public functions to educate people on dairy farming. There's actually this one story of when the band Mumford & Sons came to my hometown. She actually taught them how to milk a cow, and she had no idea it was them until her son told her otherwise, so that's just a very cute story in general. Another part we can address the misinformation is with digital literacy, and this is really it's very important, and a lot of people know we need to address it. We just have no idea how. And despite the fact that many social media sites have employed or tried to employ some form of fact-checking and have tried to moderate their sites, social media by and large will not remove all misinformation, and by and large they probably don't care. So it's important for us to teach people on how to evaluate the sources that they're looking at online, so that they have the skills to judge the validity of a claim on their own. I can't be doing this every day. I have other things to do. I can't get in arguments with people online about farming. I just have better things to do with my time. The final part is empathy and understanding. As I said, only 1% of the population ensures that we have the food we need on a daily basis. It's one of the most stressful jobs in the world, and many farmers are now facing uncertain times with climate change, rising costs, and falling wages, and the slow erosions of once robust communities. Having compassion and taking the time to learn and listen can go a long way into addressing the many divides between farmers and consumers. And to finish off, this is only a part of what I hope to study, and today I focus larger on the consumer-farmer relationship. Farmers are also not immune from spreading misinformation, especially with what's happening right now in the Netherlands, with farmers protesting a sharp reduction in nitrogen emissions that could potentially impact small farms as the country urges its farmers to scale their productions, which means scaling down the sizes of herds they have. This is an issue of climate change, and it's important that we recognize that we all have a part to play. Farmers have to realize that they can't keep farming in the same way they have for decades. They must be willing to change with the times and adopt new sustainable measures. But the way in which they are protesting is easily being co-opted by climate change deniers and fascists. And farmers must do better in taking a firm stance against these people in order to protect their livelihoods. And with that, thank you for coming out and listening to what I have to say. This is a general introduction to a much more complex problem that I'm trying to understand and define and see the actual effects of and how we can design solutions for it. And if there are any questions, please let me know. I have more than enough time of the day to spend talking about farming, so thank you.
Okay, so just quick before we get into the Q&A, I just wanted to do a little housekeeping. So if you're online and you want to ask a question, please turn your camera and your microphone on, but only when you're asking the question. After that, make sure that you mute, including when Sid is responding. If you have a question and you don't want to turn on your camera, feel free to pop it into the chat now, which we're monitoring, and I can ask the question on your behalf. And please just be kind and considerate of everyone. And I guess to start, is there anyone online before we take any questions from people in the room? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any online questions yet. Anyone else?
I can go last. No, AC first.
Oh, AC first. Yeah.
So when it comes to misinformation,
Yeah.
if you're hearing like a new take for the first time, do you know of any good heuristics or red flags to look out for when you're hearing a new take to be a little bit more suspicious than normal?
So usually it would be like it's trying to be a broad generalization, or it's like trying to say, oh, this is like, it happens everywhere. It's widespread of just like these broader claims. If they're very broad and very vague, that is probably the best way of understanding misinformation. It's just like, it's too broad to fully understand or comprehend. So if it's a bit more specific, maybe there's some truth to that, but I find very broad claims, it's just like, okay, so where did you hear that at one point? Like, where did you come up with that? So again, with the example that I went on previously of dairy cows being bred specifically with genetic issues, that's a pretty broad claim to make, especially since it doesn't really fully understand genetics within farm animals in general. So, yeah. Anyone else?
Neil?
Okay, I'll go. I get 2 questions. Well, probably 3.
Okay.
The first one, just talking about the last comment you made about the farmers with the potential to lose their livelihood from what's going on.
Yeah.
Given that likely we're going to eat forever,
Yes.
how are they losing livelihood? Like, I get the fact that people are thoroughly upsetting them and causing all kinds of problems in a number of ways, but ultimately they still have crops and they still have to sell them. So where's the danger?
So the danger is that farming has changed so rapidly, I would say, in the past 7 decades or so, especially within North America, because it's moved from small family farms to giant agribusinesses that are not owned by the farmers themselves. It's owned by some investment company that decided to buy up huge swaths of land and then employ the farmers and its employees, so they don't actually own the land themselves anymore. And that's kind of why my family is no longer farming actively. The prices for tomatoes were absolutely terrible in 2019, and because hourly wages rise, and we were already competing with the tomatoes that were coming from Mexico. We don't have control over our own prices. That is set by us. So that's why we have like zero control of how much money is actually coming into our businesses, and eventually why a lot of places either had to sell or completely change their business model. It's really unsustainable. And usually the people who are forced to sell are these smaller businesses. If they're much larger, they have the better ability to navigate these financial risks, but small farms like ours didn't. And that's where the issue starts to arise. It's just like you're removing a lot of the people from the farm without actually understanding the unique culture that comes from farming communities. So, yeah.
Okay, so the next question is sort of related in a desperate kind of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's I will make everything cohere. All right. Would simulation games help? I mean, you're standing in front of the Games Institute banner, so I figured I'd bring this back around. Now, you can start with Farmville or ignore it completely, but, I mean, is this a place where, in fact, well-developed things like games and things would actually help understand what farming is all about and how it impacts the world and what happens when you take people off ownership of farms and put them into big mass, conglomerate that. I mean, that's something, I mean, I don't know a lot about the Soviet Union and the farms that happened during throughout the 20th century, but that's kind of where they went too, in a different fashion, of course. But I mean, would this, assuming you get people to play them and make them something that you actually wanted to play, would they help in some way?
It would depend on what it's actually showing, because it could be a really good informational tool of actually introducing people, especially with the high fidelity graphics or something like that, of actually introducing them to the farm. When it's not feasible or possible for people to travel outside, very urban centers to actually see what it's like to be on a farm, which is why I really appreciate the TikTok videos from various farmers, because they're actually showing their workplaces in a way that's very accessible to people. So in doing that in a more specific way of actually showing the actual work process I go into, especially since games like Farming Simulator are so dedicated to realism, when you're driving a tractor and you're trying to plow a field, you're just going to be sitting on it for like 2 hours straight. It's very slow, nothing happens, but that's very real to what work is actually like on the farm. And even speaking again to another farming game that I love playing, which was Sim Farm by Praxis, that came out in 1993, that kind of showed a bit more of the business aspect of it all. And there's an interesting narrative that I could talk about with that game, in which it really supports the idea of monoculturalism, because if you found one crop that performed really well, especially monetarily, of course you're going to be planting all of that. So that kind of plays into the more financial risks that go into farming, of like the rising and falling of prices every single month, which is something my dad has done, where he's sitting on his harvest and waiting for the right day to sell, because prices could fall dramatically the next day.
Right.
So yeah.
So, anybody got a hand up?
No, but so could you stop sharing your slides just so that people online have a better view of you? You can go again, Neil, if you want.
Just one last thing.
Yeah, of course.
So part of that's a game design issue, that if you're going to have somebody sit on a tractor for 2 hours, that's something I'm not likely to do, because I used to do it.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't want to simulate it at all. But I mean, I'm looking at things like games that could find their way into the classrooms, and these have to be they last 10 minutes maximum. And so you're looking at the difference between a strategy game versus a tactics game, right? Tactics is, how do you turn on your tractor kind of thing, right? But the strategy one is more about how do you, if you will, work with the resources you have in order to have a successful farm, and what happens when things come in and crap all over you. Right? Sorry, it's a farm, so that's going to happen. So I mean, and I don't know if that could actually get people. I mean, because if you're going to change culture, as everybody's always known, you start with kids.
Yeah.
Because then they grow up thinking, oh, wait a minute, farming is interesting, and they got all these things happening. And one of the problems is we end up with farms being in a classroom is mostly about, petting sheep and things like that, right? And so, I don't know, I'm just trying to think if we could actually make an impact.
It's also very hard, because it's like, what schools would you target? Because targeting schools that are in the densely populated parts of Toronto, you're not going to get kids that are going to go onto the farm, because it's just like, it's way too away farm.
But it's not matter of going into it, it's a matter of understanding what's going on.
Yeah. So in that case, maybe you want to get into the more, if you're trying to design a game, you want to talk about the more specializations of farming, of trying to encourage, you have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, to try and mitigate risk and say, okay, if I have a really terrible year for crops, at least I have some animals that, I think will carry me over into the next year of trying to teach about the interconnectedness of the various businesses that happen on the farms, because it's like, it's not just one thing you do on a farm, it's multiple things, which is kind of what my family had to do just to keep afloat sometimes, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I have more about stuff.
So can you comment about cows eating M&Ms?
Oh, okay. So to preface, there was this news article of a truck that had spilled on a highway and just had a bunch of red M&Ms. And the M&Ms were likely defected in terms of, they probably weren't good enough, the color wasn't red enough, or, it didn't have the right stamp on it. So it's not useful for human consumption, even though it's perfectly fine. So what farmers do is to supplement their feed and to ensure that there's a balanced diet within their dairy cows. They do buy stuff like this from various manufacturers, and they mix it gently into their feed. We're not force feeding cows processed sugar. It's very mixed. It's very scientific in how the feed is produced. So sometimes you may see stories like this and you'll think, oh no, what are they putting into the cows? Milk is so bad. Like, it's not. It's just, this is the part of how we mix food. And it's also part of upcycling, because if the farmers aren't going to use those M&Ms that are apparently not good enough for human consumption, where do you think they're going to go? To the landfill, of course. And that's not a good way of dealing with that either. So again, part of the system of how we try to keep things in the loop so we're not losing stuff. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
It was fun watching it. Eating M&Ms.
Eating M&Ms, it's a panic, yeah.
We do have a question in the chat now from Joe, which is, what is your favorite farm animal?
Well, that's a good one.
If you could be any format.
If I could be any farm animal, I'm probably a rooster. You know how terrifying chickens can be and how fast they are? Amazing. So we had this rooster on the farm. It wasn't part of our laying hens because we didn't want chickens. And what happened was my dad got it for free with the other laying hens he had bought. And I was with him that day. I was like 4. So it rode up in the cab of our truck. And I think it imprinted on him because he was the only one who could actually handle it. And what it would do was it would purposefully stalk you and attack you. And if you looked at it, it would innocently peck at the ground. And if you turned away from it, it would just come at you again. I love the notion of roosters. Not only that, but they're very, very pretty with their tail feathers and everything. But yeah, so probably a chicken, just because they're very interesting creatures.
I love that. Okay, so next question is from Shelby, which is really interesting, which is saying, have you seen any of this combating of misinformation with farmers who are live streaming on Twitch instead of using TikTok or something else?
I don't know. I haven't checked out the Twitch side in terms of farming, and that is a little bit interesting, but it would have to be dependent on if the farmer has the right equipment to do it. Because I know of various live streamers who actually live stream their daily lives as they're walking about, and they have to have like a serious internet connection for that, the serious phone or camera to be able to handle that amount of live streaming, and also ensure that the battery life doesn't drain completely. I don't know if some farmers actually have that availability to be able to do that, unless they're just taking like short videos, because again, you're also dealing with communities that are far out in the boonies where the internet connection is sometimes absolutely terrible.
The quality of internet in Southwestern Ontario is very poor.
I go to some places in the country where I can't even get onto data.
Yeah.
So I don't think live streaming would be a viable option for many farmers, which is why short video clips that they can bring together on their phone is much more feasible currently. And it would require farmers to go out of their way to get a streaming connection and stuff like that, because it's also, that would, if you're trying to get that type of internet connection, it also costs you a lot per month. So it's not currently feasible, so.
AC?
Have you noticed any particular elements of farming that are more susceptible to misinformation than others? Or alternatively, is there anything where it's like, yeah, tomatoes really aren't like that?
Obviously, the reason why I focused on animals is because, people see a cute picture of a cow and they're like, oh no, what's going to happen to it? So it's a very good part of playing on your sympathies. No one really has that connection to plants. Who cares about plants? I mean, I care about the plants because I worked alongside them for many days, but it doesn't have that humanizing aspect to it, which is why it's, but for other misinformation I've seen for farming, especially with plants, is that there's the whole misunderstanding of like organic is better for you, or genetically modified foods are completely bad and evil, when it's not that easy. So genetically modified food, we've been doing that for thousands of years. Again, we've been selectively breeding. You know, corn did not look like that until the indigenous peoples started selectively breeding to actually get the size of corn that we're kind of common with today, and also a variety of corn again. But because GMOs have such a bad reputation right now because of their connection to Monsanto, who, you know, like patents these seeds and forces farmers into really bad deals, especially that, you know, makes them at risk for potential liabilities. That's where the association of, oh, GMOs are bad. Organic is much better, even though organic farming is so much more stressful, I would say, than actual farming with, you know, genetically modified seeds. So that is something I see quite a bit. It's just like also the misunderstanding of like which types of non-animal foods are technically good for you. So yeah.
I'm just going to read a follow-up from Shelby real quick, who asked the Twitch question, which just said to comment briefly on farming video games. Many farmers themselves, from what they've seen, are mixed on how they feel about farming video games and the representation of their lives in a mediated form. They can see the educational benefits of initial agricultural literacy, but quite a few also just comment on how it really misrepresents the industry as well. And I've heard you say this before.
Yeah. And it's so hard to kind of like talk about the personal aspects of farming, because it's like it's so variated of being like, are you a cash cropper? Does that mean you're on the field, which is so much more stressful? Because in 2016, I think that was the driest summer we had on record. And because it was so dry, when the farmers were planting soybeans, the first didn't take because it didn't rain. They didn't seed properly, so the farmers had to sow another crop of soybeans, and just it was so dry. Versus us in the greenhouse, where we actually have a bit more control over how much water we provide with the plants. You know, we have a bit less stress in that regard, but again, it's just so many different experiences of like, what are you trying to capture? Because they're so different. Of being like, what kind of wholesome aspect of the farm are you trying to present, especially since that idea of farming is not really what farming is anymore, or what it's ever been, really. So again, it's kind of hard of being like, what are you trying to preserve in these games? What are you trying to show? Especially since these farming communities are just, you know, so busy and so interconnected in a ways that I don't think games also can fully capture.
I got one, but anybody else? Please, somebody else.
I can ask a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm like, as someone who grew up surrounded by farmland, like in a farming community, and also has like grown up to be an anti-capitalist, I find the stuff that you were saying really interesting about these big agribusinesses, because I think that, you know, farming and housing are these sort of examples of these two industries that come from these like really pure motives of people need to be fed, people need to be housed. But, you know, since then, obviously, these huge corporations have taken over a lot of these industries and they're not motivated by those motives. They're motivated by the profit motive. Yeah. And I guess one of the things that's so interesting to me about all of this is that, you know, I guess farmers are being confronted head on TikTok and stuff by people who believe this disinformation. And I'm wondering, like, if that benefits in many ways these huge agribusinesses who just get to keep on keeping on. It doesn't bother them that this disinformation is out there because they're not as deeply affected by it. Their livelihood isn't affected. And then I guess the second part of the question is, do you see any sort of like anti-capitalist farmers where, like, you know, their lives are being so deeply affected by these huge agribusinesses that they start to question, you know, like how capitalism is or late capitalism, I should say, is affecting their livelihood versus disinformation, these sorts of things? Sorry, that's a very complicated question.
No, it's so good. There's actually a really good book on this called The Myth of the Family Farm, and it's an full examination of the dominance of agribusinesses in the United States from, like, you know, Confederation onwards, of how the concept of a family farm has been used and abused by agribusinesses and by the government alike, and really who's suffering in the end is the actual small family farms themselves. So in that case, it's just it's so hard to actually get into farming, first of all, because farming is very traditional in that it's usually passed on from, father to son, parent to child, or it's passed on to another family member like mine was. So my family farm was eventually bought up by my cousin, and now he's raising his family there. And I don't know if that's going to continue on, but I know that's been a huge shift. And also the median age for farmers has also risen. It's like the majority of farmers are in their 50s. Where's the next generation that's going to come in? So if you want, and even if you're like really passionate about farming, how are you going to get into that if you don't have massive amounts of money to actually buy a farm? It's so hard to get into, which is why it's so easy for agribusinesses to come in, buy huge swaths of land, and then get a tenant to farm it. And if the tenant's not doing them well, force them out and put someone else in there. So in what I'm seeing now, and I think this has definitely changed since the pandemic, a lot of people have become a bit more concerned about where their food is coming from, but also they want to try their hand at gardening because they're bored at home. And we're starting to see, I think, a little bit more of an influx of home gardeners, which is like really exciting for me because I do like it when people actually try their hand at actually planting something, seeing it grow, how they take care of it. And also more cities are allowing for backyard chickens. I think that's a great way of having these little small sustainable farms for people. And it's kind of like an easy way to get into it, and also allowing people a bit more of that control and less of that kind of like capitalist take of trying to take that power away from the agribusinesses. So that's kind of the few things that I've seen. But the trend is like the agribusinesses are here to stay, and there's nothing changing that because agriculture is, it brings in so much money. So of course you wouldn't want to let small people have a control of that. So.
Good answer. Neil, do you want to ask your follow-up now? There's nothing in the chat.
That's it?
I'm good. Oh, sorry. Marvin. Oh, sorry, Marvin. Do you want to turn your camera on and ask your question?
I don't have my camera set up right now, but can people hear me? Okay, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to your question, Emma. So first of all, thank you for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. And you talked a lot about misinformation spread about farming or about farmers. Do you see it happen in the other way as well, where sort of misinformation is spread on purpose to not change certain practices in farming itself? Emma just talked about these large corporations. I kind of see, I would expect there's some sort of misinformation happening in the other way as well. Do you see anything like that?
I do. I think the biggest thing that would be reminiscent of that is like the whole Got Milk campaign. Oh my God, the amount of like Got Milk commercials and ads that were put out, I think in the early 2000s, which is largely purported by the dairy industry, especially in the US, because they have a completely different system from us. Canada has a supply management system for dairy. It means if you want to be a dairy farmer, this is the process you have to follow. First, you have to put a down payment, a non-refundable down payment of $10,000 and fill out a bunch of forms to the government and say, I want to be a dairy farmer. And then you're on a list for 4 years until someone sells their quota, and then there's a new dairy farm available because there's only allowed to ever be so many dairy cows on so many farms in this country to be able to produce so much amount of milk. And this has been the system since the 70s. The United States doesn't have that, so they have a really huge issue of so much dairy out there. And the problem with that is that you have then these, purported warehouses full of cheese because they had so much milk that it had to be turned into something and they couldn't get rid of it, so there's just so much cheese lying around. And that's kind of part of the system where there's no regulation and there's no control and anyone can do absolutely anything. And not only that, but the dairy lobby in the United States is just so massively powerful. And it was so massively powerful because Nixon really liked the idea of, dairy because it was bringing in so much money. And then all of a sudden the price of milk inflated because of all of that, to the point where all of a sudden it's no longer cheap and accessible. So now more people are drinking stuff full of sodas and stuff like that, which is so full of sugar. And then you have these Got Milk campaigns to push people into drinking more milk. So again, it's kind of like this cyclical loop of there's an obvious problem here. There's too much of it. So you have to try and force people to drink more of it. So I think that's kind of part of the misinformation that comes from dairy is that you need to drink massive amounts of it, which you don't. Not a lot of people should, and obviously, things in small quantities, that should be, the attitude you take towards eating absolutely anything. But especially for dairy, you can kind of see how it was pushed out. And I know this actually happened again this year, where TwitchCon this year was supported by the dairy industry, which is such a weird concept, because again, they're trying to get people to drink milk. So I think that's kind of what happens, is just like, you have too much of it, what do? Oh, ad campaigns, force people to drink it, which is just like, you don't need that much, but no one ever wants to downsize. So yeah.
I feel like we're like days away from getting gamer milk. Like gamer milk is in our near future.
Oh my god, that would be so surreal if like Twitch streamers start accepting like sponsored ads from ads from like random dairy farms. Oh my goodness, no.
Okay, so there's another question in the chat. Danny, hoping that you would share your contact info so that they could connect with you about some of the topics that were discussed.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Do you want me to put it in the chat?
That would be
or?
great if you could put it in the chat. Yes, I would. I love talking about farming, so anyone can absolutely reach out to me at any time. It's not just dairy farming I know a lot about. I know also way too much about greenhouse tomatoes. I know a bit about marijuana, a little bit, just from the growing aspect is actually really interesting. But also cash cropping. I know a bit about chicken as well, a lot about pigs. So I'm just like, I have a huge variety of farming knowledge, as you can see. So, yes.
I have one more question that's probably stupid.
There's no such thing as a stupid question.
Sure there are. Just ask my kids. So can you comment on this? I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory or not, but heritage varieties of raw fruits and vegetables are almost gone.
Yeah.
And there's, I have some doubts, if you will, on the organicness of the organic.
Oh, okay,
that
yeah.
we're buying.
Yeah.
So do you think those two are related? I know there's a lot of economic reasons that I can, discuss with you for the heritage varieties in particular, why they're not available anymore. But from your sort of day-to-day farming experience, what can you say about those two things?
So what can I say about that is I find a lot of heirloom varieties of any types of fruits. I often see this with tomatoes, because they do usually have a small section of like heirloom varieties of tomatoes in grocery stores, is that they look weird, right? They got random ridges, sometimes they're purple, the colors are slightly off. That turns consumers off. And if consumers are turned off by the color, you're going to go towards something towards that, oh, that looks more pleasing. So there's very weird beauty standards that comes for food. So in my greenhouse, we just did random, run-of-the-mill beefsteak tomatoes, which are perfectly brown, perfectly red. But as we were packing them, we would be packing them by size and by color, so green and red. But also when we were going through inspecting the tomatoes, we had to make sure there were no oddities with it. So then it would be downgraded. So instead of a number 1, it'd be classified as number 2, which is downgraded in sale, which usually just gets sold to restaurants who are just gonna be chopping it up anyway. It would not look good sitting on a fruit or vegetable stand. So that's kind of, I think, my perception of why heirlooms are not as common, is because people don't like weird looking food. Not only that, but sometimes you'll see in the grocery stores, naturally imperfect, which is so weird about like, why would you want to classify as imperfect? It is perfectly fine, but again, small imperfections that people don't like and think that may affect their food. So it gets, declassified and shoved to the side, and then a new variety comes in because it looks perfect. So I think that kind of comes in. But even for the organic food, being an organic farmer is kind of weird, because first of all, you have to be certified, which means you have to farm the land for X amount of years to receive that certification. It means that means, by the time you get to that X amount of years, the amount of pesticides, fertilizers, and nitrogen that have been mixed onto the field are kind of like out of the system. So then, now it's certified organic. So first of all, very hard to get that certification. But there's also a weird double standard that farmers themselves hold about organic farmers, where they don't kind of see them as like true farmers. They see them as like city people trying their hand at farming. And even though their method of farming is still really good, but we kind of do make fun of people for being like, oh, look, someone didn't get the Roundup in time. Look how many weeds there are in their fields. We have this kind of weird attitude about organic farmers in general. But even for organic farming, the food that is sold or branded as organic is usually a bit more expensive because there is less supply of it in the field, so it has to be more expensive. So I find organic, it's perfectly fine. In my opinion, there isn't no difference between organic and non-organic. It's just kind of people, oh, organic must be so healthy for me, I'll go and eat it, when it's kind of like not really, so. Bam.
In your research, because this was a lot of like digital mis and disinformation, have you noticed other forms of dis and misinformation, not just in the digital media stream, like in books or in media or?
Funny that you say that, but I actually have the book here.
This was a setup, wasn't it?
They don't know each other. What are you talking about?
Perfect. So, there was one course during Pam and I when we were doing our masters that required people to read this book. I was not in that course, but I was interested in hearing people read this book. It's called Eating Animals by Jonathan Foer. It was published in 2009, 2010. So at the emergence of social media. And my frustration with this book, because it was wildly popular, is that, first of all, it was endorsed by A-list celebrities in Hollywood, who are so far removed from farming in general, so okay. But then also, it's written as a serious piece of academic research. Jonathan Foer is a fiction writer. What is he doing writing this? Not only that, but he makes claims of being like, oh, people eat this amount of chickens in a year, with no source to back it up. So you get people who are coming in probably with, good intentions to make claims about, oh, eating all meat is bad, which is basically what this book does, without actually understanding of how to do proper academic research, citing your sources and actually providing information where people can find it, rather than making it this fictionalized account of, all farmers are animal abusers, which is basically his belief. Going into this book, he was actually astounded by how many good farmers he found. He went into this whole book with the idea that farmers are bad, and that they're all bad, which is just so frustrating. Not only that, but he's from New York. He's just from one of the most urban places on the earth and decides to make all of these claims about farming. So again, it's this whole divide between urban and rural populations because there's this huge wall between us, which is so hard to address, but it's just like, again, when you're getting into these sources, you have to be very critical of the people who are actually researching them and presenting them. Where did they come from? What is their actual experience with farming? Oh, you just decided to get into farming? Why? Like, why did you decide to research this? So it's very, very difficult to actually get like really good pieces of literature about farming that are, not just full of rampant misinformation. So that's kind of been my experience with it all. So, yeah.
Tell us how you really feel, though.
Oh, it's depressing all the time, but also I love farming, and if it was financially viable for me, I would be farming today, but it's not. So
I feel like that last bit was like a very good explanation of why autoethnography is needed, and why we need autoethnographers, because Sid has this lived experience that many people would not have access to. So, so I just was going to ask you all to join me in thanking Sid. Thank you. And if you are not one of our members already, I encourage you to follow the Games Institute on social media. We're on Twitter and on Instagram. If you want to hear more about other talks like this that we have upcoming. And yeah, just thank you everyone online and in person for joining us. Bye.
Thank you.